We use a tool called Prezi, which some of you might be familiar with. It's an alternative to, or an accompanying tool to PowerPoint. And we like it because we can use these classroom images and we can move hopefully quite gently around the screen, not too much zooming in and out, and build up a picture and tell a bit more of a story when we're running a presentation, which we really like to do. So we'll be using Prezi today to go through the content, and I can show you here what it does is takes us, you can see, around the screen. So it's zooming in now on the right side of the screen. I will be giving a bit more of an idea where we are in the presentation for people who are listening in and going through the presentation themselves with a link we sent through. So if I'm constantly telling you where we are in the presentation, that will be why. And we have also included a lot of text, and we've done that because, again, we realize for those of you for whom English is not your first language, it can sometimes be easier to read the text on the screen as we're speaking. So it's quite text heavy, but that's a deliberate move on our part to do that. And so I'd like to introduce our presenters for today, and would really like to also say a big thank you to Catherine and Eli, just because this is a pro bono project. Nobody's being paid to do this, and it's wonderful they've come onto this webinar to share their experience. So I'd like to do just run a brief introduction to both Catherine and to Eli, which should have jumped up on your screen there. So Catherine is the UNESCO Chair Project Manager for the Transforming the Lives of People with Disabilities, Their Families and Communities through Physical Education, Sport, Recreation and Fitness at the Institute of Technology in Tralee. I'm hoping I've pronounced that correctly. And Catherine is also the chair of the Global Partnership for Children with Disabilities, Physical Activity and Sport Task Force. And Catherine has diverse experience in the areas of inclusive physical activity, wellness and education through her policy, program development, lecturing and research experience. As a manager of a globally focused research center, Catherine aims to maximize the impact of diverse thinking and interdisciplinary approaches to develop practical, sustainable solutions to maximize opportunities for health and well-being for all. And the UNESCO Chair supports UNESCO as a UN lead agency for physical education and sport, while supporting the work of other UN agencies as they intersect with UNESCO's goals. And we also have Eli, and I'm sure many of you on the call will be familiar with Catherine and Eli, but Eli is the director of the Power of Sport Lab, which is a platform to fuel and magnify innovation, inclusion and social change through sport. Projects at the Power of Sport Lab include Disability in Sport, the Olympism Project, and Athletes for Human Rights. And Eli is also the co-founder of the Sport and Society Initiative at Brown University, and he works with the Mentor Match program at Partners for Youth with Disabilities based in Boston. From 2003 to 2008, Eli co-led a global effort to include provisions addressing sport and recreation within the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And Eli was a member of the United States Paralympic soccer team in the 1996 and 2004 Paralympic Games. And finally, just an introduction to myself as well. I seem to have shifted and isolated myself over on the right here, but we are very much a team. And so I am a co-founder and a senior consultant at InFocus Enterprises. I have over 11 years of experience as an evaluator, trainer and consultant, supporting not-for-profit organizations with evaluation and learning. And as part of that work for InFocus, I've trained and supported organizations in over 30 countries, I think, both in person and remotely through these types of initiatives. And this knowledge exchange, which we'll come to introduce a bit later, is part of our social remit at InFocus to support the sharing of learning globally, and something we just really enjoy doing. This isn't a job for us, it's something that we very much enjoy. And I've worked in the field of sport for development and other fields of development too for those 11 years, but I'm relatively new to the topic of sport and disability, so I do defer to my much more experienced colleagues for questions around sport and disability, but I'm learning all the time and I'm enjoying that learning. And we want to finally extend a thank you to Sneh Gupta and Amy Farkas Karageorgis, who are part of the organizing group for this this webinar have helped us to put it together. And the final thing is just with introducing ourselves before we move on, is just we wanted to just share an additional thing for from each of us, just about our own personal lives, just to give you an idea of us outside of work. Although mine is work related, which is very sad. But so for Catherine, this was described in the email to me as the view from my back door. Is that right, Catherine? This is the view from the back door of your house.
The term I used is my backyard, I think, Tom.
Backyard.
But
yes.
Thank you for the introduction. And yeah, I live right on the Wild Atlantic Way, which is the world's longest marked coastal route running along the west coast of Ireland, in a small village called Feenit, which is pretty beautiful. And I like living here with my husband and 2 girls and 2 dogs. It's very wild, not like that picture, sometimes up to 120 kilometers per hour winds at times. And it's mostly a sleepy little fishing village with a port that sends cranes and other things around the world. But what most people in this village will not realize today is that there are 150 people from 49 countries listening into Feenit today. So thank you everybody for joining us, and we really appreciate it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Catherine. And Eli, this is Stella eating a dinosaur. So I'll leave you to explain that a little bit further.
Yes, excellent. Well, thank you for a great opportunity to join. Yeah, this is a picture of my daughter, 11-month-old Stella Blauette. My wife, Sherry Blauette, and I live in just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. And it's just wonderful to be able to have our daughter growing up and learning all about these issues of inclusion and disability. And so thank you so much, Tom. Really looking forward to our conversation today.
Great, thank you. And just my little bit of information here. This is just to say I'm what's called a digital nomad. I have no fixed house or flat. I wander around Europe doing this job, which is mostly remote. So technically that means I can work on a beach with a cocktail. Normally it's chasing around cafes, finding good internet access. But as I said, my non-work related topic is very work related, which says a lot about me, I think. So that's us. What we'd really like to find out, first of all, and to use our poll function, is to find out how you all found out about the webinar today. It'd be really useful for us. It'd be just an interesting chance to try out our little poll tool that we have. It's one of the ways we can engage with you all on the webinar. So I'm just going to launch this now, and we'll be doing this a couple of times throughout the webinar. And so you'll see a question jump up on your screen. If you can complete that, we'll just give it we normally give it a minute to fill in, and then we share the results with you all. Although you're all filling in so quickly, it's probably going to be quicker than that. And just while that's being filled in, just to let you know, so we've got I think it's about 50 to 60 of you on the webinar. It tips up and down at the moment. There are about 150 registered, but many of those to get hold of the recording and join future webinars. So it's somewhat of a community in that respect. But great to have you all on today. And we'll just now shut down that poll. Got 90% of you taking part, and then just share that. So it should have jumped up on your screen. So majority of you are referred by a colleague coming in, but a good number of you coming through UNESCO, through Bond, through the ISDPA mailing list as well. But it's something we may ask in future. It's just useful for us to know how best to reach you. So and a way to try out our little polling tool. There'll be some more interesting polls coming up a bit later as well. And so what I'd like to do now is just to introduce you to this overall project. This is one webinar in a series of 6 webinars, and we call them the overall. The name that we give the webinars is the Sport and Disability Knowledge Exchange. I have just lost my place, which sometimes Prezi does. So I'll be just coming back to full screen and then finding my place and then sharing the screen again. So, okay, and so I wanted to give a very brief overview of the project and the background between 2016 and 2017, Laureus Sport for Good Foundation supported us to run a learning community to work with 6 sport for development organizations around the world working in the area of disability as part of a learning community. And what came out of that was a theory of change that we'll come to a bit later. And we were really exploring with this small group some of the differences and similarities in the way those organizations worked around the world. And the project finished in January this year, and we were quite keen to continue. And we'd engaged with a wider group. Some of you are on the call from the webinar we had in December, where we actually engaged with I think 30 or 40 organizations. So that we thought went very well, and we wanted to continue. And so this year we're running a series of 6 webinars like this one, but in future there'll be a bit less theory heavy and a bit more exercise focused, because we won't have to do this introduction each time. We'll package this as a video for anyone that's new. And so we're going to have 6 webinars this year, topics to be confirmed, that will bring together practitioners, funders, researchers, all of you working in this field to share experience and insights. And we're starting to line up our speakers, who are very kindly offering their time and expertise. And so you can see these dates, you can plan in advance. This is when we're going to be running these across the year. And the objectives of this project of the Knowledge Exchange are to really just to explore the commonality, the differences. I hope commonalities is a word, but there we go. But to look for and explore the common elements, but also the differences in the way that we work in this field around the world. And it's a good point to say that actually it's a bit of a risk in many ways, because we want this to be quite interactive. We want to have exercises that we run a bit later in the webinar. That there is an exercise where we will hear from the group, and we've got the Q&A section too. We're trying to mix presentations with exercises, and with such a big group, a mix of backgrounds, languages, it is a bit risky, but something we're really willing to risk, because we think there's real value in collecting together your feedback because of all these diverse backgrounds. So it is just to say, as we kick off this project, that it may not all go to plan. We may find that some ways of delivering webinars are better than others for this, and adapt as we go. And the end product we're going to develop, and I can start to share this on the second webinar using the information from today. We're developing a new theory of change based on the version here, which you can all access, which is from the previous project I just mentioned with Laureus. And we're going to be updating this. And a theory of change, for those of you who don't know, it's a way of outlining how activities lead to social change and the assumptions relating to that. And so we'll be taking information from these 6 webinars and updating this document. And so we'll have a solid end product to share. And we're also looking at whether we can pull together the learning from the 6 webinars into a journal article at the end of the year to share more widely. And then we're into terminology. So Teddy Roosevelt comes up a couple of times in this presentation, and the quote here is about the challenge with terminology, which we all completely accept is at our side on the organizing team, is we accept it's there because we are from different backgrounds, different languages, different cultural contexts. And so we've had to ground these 6 webinars with certain terminology. And you may agree or disagree or use different terminology, but we've had to settle on something, or we're going to get very confused. And so for disability, we've used the definition from the CRPD. And so we use the term persons with disabilities, or person with a disability. And I realize that's different in many countries. It may well be disabled person. It may well be there may be a different term, but we have to settle on something. So we've gone for using the CRPD as our reference point, and using generally the definition. So persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. And so that's our definition we're using. Always happy to be challenged, but we've needed to fix on something to avoid any confusion. And it's similar with the term sport for development, because it could be sport through development, sport and development. We've used sport for development, and we mean by that the intentional use of sport, physical activity and play to attain specific development objectives in low and middle income countries and disadvantaged communities in high income settings, which comes from the Sport for Development and Peace International Working Group. So if we're talking about sport for development, this is what we're referring to. But as Eli pointed out in our preparation for this webinar, there are other terms. That there's a distinction between sport development and sport for development that's often out there and used. So many of you might well be involved more in sport development, so primarily focusing on developing sport, or more specifically a certain sport, and it involves strategically developing a specific sport or number of selected sports through investments, increased publicity or other means. So the aim is to introduce more people to the sport, involving them as players, fans, sponsors or advocates. So I think we're only highlighting this distinction because if you're working primarily in sport development, you're welcome on these webinars too. We're not we talk a lot about sport for development. We're not excluding those of you who might be more into sport development. And we recognize too that can be a very blurred, fuzzy line between these two definitions, because if you are getting more people into sport and physically active, that's of course a really admirable aim to be working towards. So I think it's more we're making these distinctions which come from Jutta Engelhardt from SAD on sportanddev.org. We're making these distinctions clear more to say you're welcome to join than anything. And finally, because I'm a little over my time already, I want to give you a quick overview of the agenda for today. And so we've gone through the technical introduction, introducing the presenters. I want to give you that bit of background to the project today, and then going through the agenda here. We'll be going through universal design, asking you a quick question about that with Eli. We're going to then have an activity around 35 minutes, might be a bit less because I've already gone over. There we go. Then Catherine's going to take you through a live example, a real life example of universal design in practice. And then we'll go into wrap up and next steps. And you've got the Q&A at the end to ask any questions of me about the initiative, but on the actual topic of inclusive activities for Eli and Catherine. And what we'd like you to do is to type in your questions as you go, as we go throughout the webinar. You're welcome to type them at the end too, but it allows us to collect them and be able to process that a bit more easily. And there'll be that chance to engage a bit more when we have our exercise as well. We can't hear back from everybody, but what we will do is use all the feedback afterwards, with your permission, to and send out the results. So even if we don't hear from you today, we're certainly going to be using the information as we go. I hope that was really useful as an introduction. I think the final thing is just to say we're not here to I hope it doesn't come across we're here to preach, to tell you how to do something. We've got such a diverse group. I don't think we really could do that. We're here to give you some ideas, but we recognize everybody is at different stages of organizational development, of individual knowledge. As you know from my introduction, this is a learning curve for me, and it's all about doing what you can with what you have where you are at a point in time. So even if this gives you some one or two ideas to take forward, or one or two more things to read, we're happy from our side. But please don't feel like we're telling you how to do something. We're more about sharing knowledge and understanding whether it applies, and happy to be challenged. And so I'd like now to come to our main green board here. And this is where we'll be going through the concept of universal design. And we'll be going through these different topics with Eli, all about universal design. And the first thing we'd like to do is just to get you all involved again and ask you, how familiar are you with the concept of universal design? If you'd asked me this before preparing for this webinar, I would say not very familiar. It's quite new to me, but would love to know how familiar you all are with it. So we're just going to pop this up on the screen as well for 30 seconds to a minute. And while you're doing that, I'll be giving a very quick introduction to why we've gone towards the concept of universal design and why we've explored it, and then it will be passed over to Eli then. So we'll just give maybe 10 more seconds to vote, and then we'll go into the topic. Okay, I think we'll close that there. So just want to share the results with you all. And so it's interesting, 45% would be like myself, really. I would say I would be not at all familiar when I came into this topic. 17% slightly familiar, 7% somewhat familiar, 21% moderately familiar, and we have 10% of real experts, I would say, as well, coming into the mix as too. So thank you for taking part in that. Always interesting to know. And I'm just going to give this very quick introduction before we come to Eli. And so just when we worked on the 2016 or 17 learning community, a question kept coming up, and it was about what is an inclusive activity. So you can see here, this is a page from the outcomes section of our theory of change we developed as a group. Some of you who developed this are on the call, and you'll see on the left, we've got this point about, well, coaches are trained to deliver inclusive sporting activities. And this kept coming up, but we didn't really have, as a group, a definition for what we meant by inclusive activities. And so we thought, let's explore it and let's get a global perspective on it. And luckily we had Eli involved with our group, and I will now pass over to him, because in our webinar in December, we had with, I think, 30 or 40 organizations, it kept coming up for us to have a look at universal design as a framework to explore inclusive activities. And so without further ado, I will pass over to Eli. Are you with us there, Eli?
Great, excellent. Yeah, thank you so much, Tom. And yeah, we can sort of jump into just sharing a little bit about what universal design is. I do think that previous work that was done on the logic model and things like that, and what is inclusion, it did sort of raise awareness about how it would be helpful to think about universal design and how it contributes to this and all the work that we're doing around the world in terms of creating opportunities and access and inclusion. So yeah, universal design is a framework for the design of places, things, information, communication, and policy to be usable by the widest range of people operating in the widest range of situations without special or separate design. Most simply, universal design is human-centered design of everything with everyone in mind. So that's sort of an introductory definition. And then it's just really interesting to see the universal design is sometimes referred to as inclusive design, design for all, lifespan design. There's other words that are used to talk about universal design. And so we'll keep moving forward, and I'm going to go through some of the different components and different ways to kind of think and wrap our head around universal design. So I'll ask Tom to pull up the diagram. So one way that's to think about, just as a background framework for thinking about universal design, is the way that the World Health Organization has developed the international classification of functioning, disability, and health. And really, this is just a way to help us think about focusing not specifically on the disability and the health condition, but really to think about the function and the activity at the center and the different factors that are influencing. So the environmental factors, the personal factors, social participation, the body and function structure. So all these different components interact. And really the center of this is about thinking about the design process in terms of how are we really thinking about the person at the center, about thinking about the way that we can use universal design to help us ensure that we're not focusing on the disability or the impairment or the condition as the first thing, but instead we're focusing on function, and we're focusing about looking at the solutions that we're trying to create. So this framework here is just another way to start thinking about universal design, and the World Health Organization and its contributions allow us to start that as well. So we'll keep moving along, and then these pieces will come together as we tell this story. So just a short history on universal design is that the initial concept was really in the early 50s, particularly in Europe, Japan, and the United States. And in the 70s, it really started to build momentum, particularly coming with regard to more of the physical structure, so Architectural Barrier Act, in terms of education, and the Rehabilitation Act, and other legal frameworks as well started to help us think about the fact that we need to think about removing barriers and thinking about the design of our environments. And really this framework of universal design started to build momentum and build steam. The person that's sort of known to be to have coined this term is Ron Mace, an architect, a product designer, and educator who really helped to develop this concept. He was based out of North Carolina State, and then he worked in collaboration with an international alliance of other individuals and organizations to put together this the framework, but also an international body that really promotes and works around universal design. And again, a universal design is really a framework that has been particularly applied in many other areas of society and many other aspects. And so it's important to now think about how does this apply into the sport, physical activity, physical education, recreation, and play space that we're all working in. And so that's part of what we're trying to look at, is taking the framework of universal design and beginning to apply it into all the things that we do. And then when Catherine takes up the second part of the conversation, she'll then be able to dive in even more. So this next part is really the crux of what we wanted to share with regard to universal design, the principles and the environments. So we're going to focus on the four environments, and then Tom, you can pull up the other part as well. And the 7 principles. So the 4 environments that we're focusing on and that are part of the framework are the built environment. So really looking at physical space, products, places. So really looking at the actual tangible physical aspects of our environment. The second environment is information and communication. So how do we communicate? What are the signs and the images and the ways that we are making meaning out of our world from an information and communication standpoint? And the third environment is the policy environment. So what policies are in place that help to reinforce what needs to be done from an inclusion standpoint? And then fourth, in many ways, I think is really the core of this is the attitudinal. Is an organization, is a community really approaching inclusion from a solution-oriented perspective? Are they having an attitude that is accepting and welcoming, or is the attitude exclusive and creating even more barriers? So those are the 4 environments. And then when we think about the principles of creating inclusion and universal design, these 7 principles of equitable use, flexibility in use, simple, intuitive, perceptible information, tolerance for error, low physical effort, and size and space for approach and use. So when we begin to think about our programs, when we begin to think about the different games or sports or activities that are introducing sport for development and education and other kinds of outcomes coming through, it's important to think about these principles and these environments and how we can begin to introduce them. so we can, and the activity that we'll do shortly is to try to really make it tangible of what's an actual example. So thinking of a gym space as a physical environment, and is the gym, is the fitness center, is it accessible? Can people with disabilities actually even get into the building? Can they access the facilities, the equipment? Is there signs, and is there ways that they know where to go? Is there a policy in place? Are the staff and the managers, are they educated and informed about disability, and do they have an attitude that's inclusive? So that's just a quick example, and then we'll begin to talk even more about other examples as well. But this here, the 4 environments, 7 principles, this is really the main takeaway here. But we're going to go to the next piece of this equation, and we're just going to talk briefly about putting universal design into some context. So part of universal design that's really important to think about is how do we gather this information of creating an inclusive space, and who provides the input on what can be inclusive and how to provide these solutions. And a key component of the universal design is what's called a user expert, or a person with the disability background, with the experience, to be able to provide the input and to provide the design perspective, so that in terms of creating the environment, that the user expert, or the person who has the disability, is able to provide that input. So the user expert can include parents managing with toddlers, older people with changing vision, stamina, people of short stature, limited grasp. These diverse people have developed strategies for coping with barriers, and they can then provide the input on how the environment can best suit them. So again, oftentimes you'll see a program that's put in place without even asking or getting input from the families or those people with disabilities. So we'll then turn to the final point before turning it over to our follow-up Q&A. So this question about universal design, how universal is universal design? And so I just wanted to touch briefly on the fact that the universal design has sometimes mistakenly been described as the search for a one-size-fits-all design. And so it's really important to think about the fact that universal design is not about creating a one-size-fit-all for everybody, but it's about creating the appropriate kind of context. So considering the different diversity of disability, the differences in sports, the different needs, all the different elements that come into our sports and physical activity programs, it's important that we may be more flexible, that we may be more adaptable to think about the different types of inclusion that we're creating. So it's important to think about slightly different routes, different interfaces, that we look at creating as many possible people to be involved in the ways that can be done, but at the same time to realize this spectrum of inclusion. And so I'll ask Tom to pull up this diagram to help us think about the different approaches and the different ways that we can think about an activity. So there's been some really good work done around thinking about an inclusion spectrum in terms of looking at kind of the different approaches to inclusion, from fully integrated, modified, parallel activity, a discrete activity, adapted. So we're going to talk more about this as Catherine gets into some more examples. But I think the key thing here is to really think about the flexibility, the range. And so again, that universal design is not a one size fits all for everything, but it's more of that mindset for thinking about the design process and the way that we're approaching inclusion in our programs, in our sport for development work, and all the things that we do, that this framework of universal design can really contribute quite a bit. And so when we turn it over to Catherine to talk even more about programmatically on the ground, another framework of thinking about this approach, this hopefully is sort of a good starting point so that we can then move forward. So I'll turn it back to Tom and then over to Catherine.
Great, thank you, Eli. Much appreciated. And what we're going to do now is to put some of this into some of that thinking into action, and looking to hear back from the group as well. And what this is where our webinars and where the knowledge exchange gets a little more ambitious, because we're looking to in a quite short space of time get input again from quite a diverse group, impressively diverse group. So what we'd like to do is to go through an exercise.
Yeah, Tom, the four environments. Yeah.
Sorry, it should be 4. We modified it down. Two of the 5 we originally looked at we thought could be combined. So sorry, that's why I missed that. Apologies. So we're actually going to look at 4 environments, not 5. And we're going to just ask you all to input into this and to get your experience. So if we now come out of here and just into a tool called Linoit, you're going to see jump up on the screen. And a couple of you did point out too, it's meant to be 4, not 5. So apologies. So we've got the 4 environments here. You should be seeing jump up on your screen. So the first is the built environment, the physical indoor and outdoor aspects of a venue. The second is the attitudinal environment, so staff or administrative behavioral beliefs. The third is the policy environment, policies that impact quality of experience. And I should modify that too. That should be for all participants. That's from the example I took it from.
Yeah.
And then finally, oh, sorry, Eli.
Yeah, the built environment can include products and places, and so it's kind of inclusive of all the physical aspects. Yeah, just people may think of a product, you know, they may think of equipment, things like that as well. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
Yeah.
And then finally, the information and communication environment. So how is information passed on to and shared with participants?
Yeah.
And so what we're going to ask you to do, and Eli's going to help me with, is just, so our question is here at the top, and what we'd like to know from you all is, how can we ensure sport and disability activities are more inclusive? And so we'd like to really start with the built environment, and we're just going to ask you all, you've got a, we're not going to bring in anybody on audio because it will be tricky in the time that we've got, but what we'd like to ask you all to do is to have a think, starting with the built environment. What actions could you take, and what actions do you take as a project, if you work directly on activities, to make sure activities are more inclusive in relation to the built environment? And we'll give just perhaps a minute or 2 for you all to have a think about that, and then we'll start to gather feedback. But it's just to write that into the question boxes if you can, and if you'd like to take part. So I'll just pop myself onto mute just for a minute or 2 while we leave you to have a think and write in your responses, starting with the built environment. Okay, so we've got responses starting to come through. So I'm just going to start to add those in as we go. And so what Linoit allows us to do, and we'll be using this a lot across the webinars this year, it just allows us to, as you'll see in a moment, just to bring up a little post-it note, and then to drop in your responses as we go. So we'll start with Paul Brackley, and Paul is from Albion in the Community, and was one of actually the original members of our group in the 2016-17 project. So he's mentioned a couple of things. So firstly, they'd love to see a greater range of specialist equipment available within more mainstream retailers, and also just more generally from Paul that it's just hugely important just that facilities in the UK, United Kingdom, are more accessible. So just 2 points there from Paul. Just going to add these in. And Paul's also mentioned it's also with equipment costs being too high as well. So that starts us off from Paul, and I'll now go to the next piece of feedback, and this is from Elaine, and Elaine Tromi, if I've pronounced that correctly, who's a sport and development manager at Special Olympics Ireland. And I have to apologize to everybody because I'm going to mangle quite a few names on this call, I'm sure. Elaine has mentioned, so involvement in community develops ensure build elements for people with disabilities are included at the earliest phase. So just add that to Paul's feedback as well. And then just keep going around the group. So we're getting lots of feedback coming in. Oh, thank you, Elaine. So to me is good enough, probably incorrect, but it's my best attempt. So for getting names correct. Okay, so we'll come now to Papu Modak, and Papu is from Sport for Hope and Independence. He's a co-founder and head of sports development in Bangladesh. So you can start to see with this feedback, we're jumping around the world here, which is always really exciting. So Papu has mentioned that he feels, I think, awareness of inclusive sports for parents is most important startup. Then creating physical structures and equipment can be adapted according to availability. So again, building, I think, a little on Paul's point too about availability of what specialist equipment is available. So we'll just pick on maybe 2 more. So we're going to try and get 5 for each category, and then we will collect all the other responses after the webinar and share with them. So we've now got Richard McGrath, and Richard is a lecturer from the University of South Australia. Richard, are you calling in from Australia? Because it must be, that is commitment if you are, because it must be 2 in the morning, I guess. I'm not sure. So Richard has mentioned working with participants to identify physical need access is key, and developing an understanding of the financial constraints faced by participants and families. So thank you, Richard, for that. And yeah, definitely keen to know, Richard, where, oh, it's 11:30 at night. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining so late. Much appreciated. And so we'll take a final comment. And this is from, I'm just going through my list as we go. This is from Icicle, and I may well have got that wrong, but Icicle Askoy from Middle East Technical University, who, and welcome back, because I know you were with us in December as well. And she's mentioned that places should be appropriate for the activity as well. So we've got our 5. So we're going to stick with that. We're going to try and get 5 for each of these categories. And as I mentioned, we're going to then afterwards just add these all together. So if I haven't got to you, I apologize, but we will just move on to the second point. So now if we can think about the attitudinal environment. So this is about the behavioral beliefs of the staff or administrators who are running the activity. So what kind of attitude do they need to have or need to adopt? Be great if you can again have a think about that, and to drop in your feedback into the question box, and we'll again we'll give a minute or 2 and then start to bring you in on that.
It can be the
yes.
attitude of the community as well. I mean, it can be other factors. From a universal design perspective, it can be factors outside of the organization. It could be attitude is cultural as well as organizational. So yeah.
Okay, I will just add that.
Yeah. So it says the staff or administration. It can be broad. Yeah, it can be beyond. Yeah. Wider community. Perfect. Yeah.
Perfect. And so we've started to get feedback on this back too. and we'll try and hear from as many of you as possible, but it's starting to flow in, which is awesome. So thank you all for engaging with this.
This is always a popular one for sure. Yeah.
Is it? Yeah. Okay, so we'll start with Doreen, and Doreen is calling in from UNRISD from Switzerland, she's a communications and research consultant. So what I've done, just to let you all know, is I've got all the names and organisations pinned up in front of me from, I think, yesterday evening's register for the webinar. That's where I'm getting all your organisations from. And so Doreen has mentioned it's important for individuals to be non-discriminatory, to have an understanding of visible and invisible disabilities, and an understanding of different needs and sensitivities. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
And if we now come to Steve Weaver, and Steve is a fitness advisor from Special Olympics International, calling in from the USA. And Steve's mentioned that early educational training opportunities, working with the population to ensure proper training and attitudes is important. So thank you to Steve. And also feel free as a group to feedback on anyone else's comments. We may not be able to bring it in, but we will certainly try, or we certainly will pull it all together after the webinar. So we've now got an input from Candice. And Candice, you're not in my list, I think, because I saw your webinar come in just after I'd created the information. So Candice, if you can just drop in where you're from as well, just so I can share. But Candice has mentioned the understanding of different disabilities is also important, and education around that.
Yeah.
And we'll take two more. And Candice is calling in from California in the US. Thank you, Candice. And we'll come now to Andrea Ruiz. And Andrea, Andrea is a psychologist from Special Olympics in Peru. That's written in Spanish there, but I won't show my appalling Spanish pronunciation. So Special Olympics Peru, and Andrea has mentioned it's really important to work as a team and to listen to all of the people, families, teachers, etc., in terms of needs, without leaving anyone aside.
Yeah. And
Eli, I can hear you agreeing with each as we go.
It's all really good feedback. Yeah, excellent.
And we'll take a final comment from Emisa, and Emisa is from VSO. Emisa is a ICS program coordinator from Kenya, and they've mentioned, I'll just check, that it's important for them to be knowledgeable about different kinds of disability and know how to support people with these disabilities, which is great. And you can see the feedback starts then to overlap, which is always really exciting in these webinars, because especially with, you can hear it's several different countries feeding in. So we actually have three relating to the understanding of different disabilities. Might actually, Eli, be an interesting topic to explore in future webinars as well, actually.
Yeah.
Great. So we've got 5 for that. So we're now, again, we'll pull all the feedback together after the webinar, because there's some brilliant stuff coming through from all around the world, and it's going to be really exciting. I think we'll pull it together into a bit of a chart for you, and mention where each of this feedback is coming from. But we'd like now to move to the policy environment, so policies that impact equality of experience for all participants. And while you're all thinking of that, Eli, I guess a question for you on this. I had assumed, with my limited knowledge, that this was about the internal policies of the organization, but might be actually the policies of, I guess, government too. Is this all encompassing, or is it more?
Be both. Yeah, the policies of an organization, as well as societal, local, regional, national policy. state policy, other just policies that have an influence on the programming.
Got it. Okay.
Societal, yeah. Yep, perfect.
Great. So you can all hear I'm learning as we go. Right, we've got some input coming in. Ron Peck, who is the creator and co-founder of the Blind Judo Foundation from the USA. And also, Ron, you sent us some really interesting questions before the webinar, which we're going to try to get to in a Q&A, but if not, we'll try to respond to. But Ron has mentioned the zero tolerance of bullying in or off the activity. So I guess within the activity or away from it, being a really important organizational policy. So then if we come to Alexandra, and Alexandra is from the AHRSA Foundation. So thanks also for typing that in. So saves me finding it also on the list. And so Alex has mentioned, and I'll just copy this to bring it up. So Alex has mentioned AHRSA, the non-profit arm of the Trade Association for Health and Fitness Clubs. So Alex, welcome to the webinar. And Alex has mentioned that having seen state legislation in the US requiring people with disabilities have equitable access to PE in sport and school, I think we need more focus on this inclusion versus separating them or excusing from PE. So it's great because that's starting to look at the state level. We've got one related to the organization, one relating to state level. So thank you, Alex, for that. And if we come now to Katarina Schulte, and Katarina is a coordinator of sport and development at UNESCO Chair in Inclusive Sport from Ireland. For some reason, I think I gave your name a German feel to it there, a German pronunciation, but that may be the case. But adaptation of, so Katarina has mentioned here the adaptation of international policies at national and community level, most importantly supporting implementation of those policies. So the first time actually that we've got also the implementation of the policy coming up rather than just the policy itself. I can definitely hear you agreeing there, Eli, as well.
Yeah, adaptation and adoption and adaption. Yeah, both.
Adoption and adaption.
Yeah, exactly. That's good.
Nice. Then from Caitlin Ruddock, and Caitlin is from is a PhD student from the University of Alberta in Canada, and Caitlin's mentioned flexibility in policy, so offering subsidized rates to access programs based on income. So looking at equity, not equality, which is really interesting. That's something would be really good to explore further, actually. And then if we take a final point, and I mention that because again, to be, I'm not always clear on that difference between equity and equality, which is why I'd quite like to explore that further. That's just my own lack of knowledge coming in there, but that would be really, really interesting to explore. Oh, Katarina, you mentioned you are from Germany, so I may have got your pronunciation of your name right. I hope so. So we'll get one more piece of feedback, and then we'll move to our final topic. So we'll go to get some feedback from Craig. So Craig Cameron is the Director of Programs and Partnerships at Alberta Recreation and Parks Association, so also from Canada. And he's mentioned that working with municipal councils to include meaningful language and specific direction related to inclusion and access. So working at a council, a local authority level. I think local authority would be I guess, a global way of describing councils. I'm not sure if that's a UK, Canada, US sort of term, but then working with them to identify solutions and remain accountable to the policy direction. So working, the partnership element, I think, Eli, is really important there. That
yes.
Too. So great. Thank you. So we've got 5 responses there. We've got many more than 5 coming in, which we can use, which is really exciting. And you can hear, I hope we're trying to go, and here we've heard from, I think, 15 people so far. We are trying to pick, so we have somebody who's not gone before. So we're going to come to and we've got some really detailed, really interesting feedback here that we're going to write up and share, because it's Eli's reading it as well with me. It's really, really interesting. So we're going to come to our final topic. So this is about information and communication environment. I've defined it here from the documents I was looking at as how information is passed on to and shared with participants. Eli, anything?
Yeah, I can just add that it's both print material, visual, signage, just the different ways that are communicated to us in all the ways that happens. So that could be, a sign on the wall, directions, wayfinding. Where do you go? How do you get to the facility?
Sure.
Those kinds of things. Yeah.
Would it also be, I guess, once you're delivering an activity, then as well, is this about how you explain an activity to people? Is it any way of?
Yeah, it can be your instructions, your brochures. Are they inclusive? Do they have visuals? Do they have language that communicates disability inclusion? All those kinds of things. Yeah, exactly.
Great. So thank you, Eli. No, it's good to confirm. So I think we'll start with Shannon Weissman, and Sharon is a master's student from University of Toronto from Canada. So we've had a flow of Canadian input purely by chance. I can't see the country you're all from on the list. So we've got Canada being very well represented in the last few comments. So Sharon has mentioned, and I think this relates to the information point. Forgive me if not. I thought it was a good point. But the use of integrate knowledge translation, models, theories, and strategies to market inclusive programs and alter the social perspective of inclusive programming, which I think definitely belongs in the information communication environment point. I would really be interested personally to Shannon, sorry, not Sharon, Shannon, to learn more about IKT. Eli, is that something you've come across? Or?
Yeah, no, I'm familiar. Yeah, it'd be good to include that in our notes and things. Yeah.
Yeah. So Shannon, if you have some links for that to share, that'd be awesome if we could. Perfect. Thank you. So we're going to take 4 more comments, and then we'll come out of the activity and we'll go over to Catherine for a live example. So we'll take a few more minutes here. So if I could now come to, I'll just come down my list. Oh, and Silvana, you've been sending notes, but they disappear, and they do keep disappearing. Oh no, sorry, Silvana, we do still have your notes. It just keeps showing that you've left for some reason, so they won't show up. But we've got them, so we will include them in the activity. So, okay, if we now, I'm just trying to look. We'll probably come back to people who have come in before, but that's fine. We'll just go back to. I thought it's a really good point here. So Isagul, and if we could come to you first, I'll just take your comment here. 1 second. So again, Isagul is from the research assistant at the Middle East Technical University. And sorry, that's from the last one. I've just got a challenge with copying and pasting here for some reason. There we go. So she's mentioned technology support can be added using devices, tablets, projectors to produce bigger pictures in a gymnasium if needed. And to pack, definitely a topic to consider for teaching PE to individuals with disabilities. Eli, to pack, have you come across that?
Yes, I've heard of it. Yeah, no, it'd be good also just to gather all this information.
Any links on to pack would be much appreciated as well. That would be brilliant. So thank you for that too. So we'll take three more points. So Rob, if we could come to you, and also welcome back. I know you were with us in December, so Rob's point, and sorry, I should mention. So Rob is the East of England regional manager for Sported in the UK, and he's mentioned it's often about knowing and trusting the organisation delivering the activities. If a trusted organisation is delivering it or endorses the activity, it makes it safer and more accessible to some disabled people. So word of mouth or endorsement is just as important as visual communication, such as posters, etc. I would definitely agree, and it's taken us in a slightly different direction, so that's much appreciated.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you, Rob. And we'll take two more, and then we will be passing over to Catherine then for the live example. Oh, and thank you for the links coming through as well. Much appreciated. So if we can come to Minraj Panthi, and Minraj is a disability inclusion specialist from Plan International Nepal, from Nepal. So again, welcome, as with everybody, to the webinar. And oh, this might have been back on the policy point. Policy should be considered into two parts. One part for protection, another part is anti-discrimination. So we'll add that. It was a really good point, and we'll add that into the policy element here. So thank you. So you can also start to hear the global nature of this webinar. And so we'll now just come finally to Damien Haslett. So Damien is a PhD researcher from the University of Birmingham in Ireland, and we'll leave it to you, Damien, to have the final written say in our exercise. Understand the whole communication network surrounding physical activity information. So for example, the methods, so online, word of mouth, traditional methods, the messengers, formal, informal, trustworthy, and the receivers of the message, so individual needs and their individual needs, and the interaction of this communication. So I guess taking a more holistic approach to considering communication, not just the means, but also who is delivering it and who's receiving it, which I thought, Eli, was really interesting. Yeah,
that's great. Yes.
Lays it out quite, very logically there.
Yes. Excellent.
Great, thank you. So just with an eye on the time, we're going to stop at that point. What often happens here is that participants do keep writing in their responses as something they think of comes up, and you're more than welcome to do that. If you could just write before it, if you're talking about the built attitudinal policy or information communication environment, we'll add it into our feedback. So I will say again, and I know I'm a bit repetitive on this, but I really want to assure you that we're going to combine all this feedback. That's going to be my job after the webinar, which I'm excited to do, with who it's coming from, into a couple of, I think, some diagrams. So we're not ignoring anybody. You will get your feedback recognized and shared, because there's really interesting stuff coming out here that we can digest and pull together and send out to you all. So we will just stop at that point, but just to really thank you all for your feedback. I think we heard from about I think 18 or 19 different individuals and organizations from around the world, And I think, Eli, I mean, that's really interesting to me. And
yeah, this is great. It's also a great baseline for going over to Catherine for her piece of it. Yeah, it's really good.
Exactly. And in future webinars, we're going to have less of the introductory element that I was doing and put that time into these exercises, because we're, again, really keen to hear from you all. So without further ado, the next part of our webinar is to go over to Catherine, who's really kindly put together a live example of universal design. And then in 20 minutes, we'll then come to the Q&A section then. So please do write in any questions that you do have, and we're going to pull them together for that Q&A section. And that's where we'll bring you in and you can actually ask your question directly as well. So Catherine, is it all right now to bring you in? And thank you, Eli, for your input on that exercise too. That's really much appreciated.
Yeah, that's perfect, Tom. Thank you.
Oh, and I didn't bring up your diagram. I got right into which you suggested, which we were going to. So you might want to start there, actually, Catherine, too, because we did intend to bring this up before the activity, and I got excited and went straight into the activity.
Yeah. It's absolutely fine. Don't worry. I think the discussion that came up there during the activity captures all the elements, though, that are on this pathway to diversity. And the quote that you mentioned earlier from Teddy Roosevelt, which was about doing what you can with what you have from where you are. So we developed this pathway to diversity that I think is relevant to everybody who's on the webinar, no matter where they're calling in from. I think that was evident from the comments that came through there. We developed this in 2015 as a tool for people to identify the inclusiveness of practice in their country, in their program, their policy, or a service, whatever it might be. We called it the pathway because it reflects a journey, and we want everyone to kind of look at inclusion as a journey towards mainstreaming diversity, which is point 3 there on our pathway. It's a journey that everyone needs to get on, because, you know, we all know the evidence is there that the world is not particularly accessible at this point in time, but people need support to make everything more inclusive, and a bit of encouragement and guidance. As new practices emerge to support the development of new professionals across all professions that have a role to play there, it would be critical in shaping the inclusiveness of our world. So what we're hoping with the pathway is, even, you know, through vocational preparation of professionals, inclusive practice should be embedded into their qualifications. And then in the future, we'll see perhaps universal design as more of a norm from the outset. However, our pathway at the moment, we acknowledge the need to recognise the rights of all, everywhere. We all know the human rights underpinning physical education, physical activity and sport. And the journey starts with the realisation that people's fundamental rights need to be recognised. And I think in different countries, across different programme areas, we're in different places regarding fully recognising those rights and enabling people to participate fully and effectively in physical education, physical activity and sport. Then we're where we are now in most places, I think, inclusivizing practice. It's about determining what needs to be done to make something, an existing policy, service or program, inclusive. We invented the word inclusivize. So Tom, you spoke earlier about making up words. We did make this one up to capture the process involved of making practice inclusive. Inclusion and universality are not always as black and white as they're sometimes made out to be. It can be about creating and innovating, being open and willing, or being trained and equipped. At this stage, I think in many areas we're retrofitting inclusion, and most of us are currently doing a lot of this. Where we want to get to is mainstreaming diversity, providing for all people as part of our main offer, not as a specialist area, but as part of the main offer, not an add-on and not a retrofit. Currently, I think countries, organizations, programs are at different stages on the pathway. And what's pretty universal, even the comments that came up earlier, is that there's more work to be done. And whether you're in a low, middle or high income country, there is an opportunity for everyone to do something to kind of create a much more universally designed world, and especially as it relates to physical education, physical activity and sport. So that's what the pathway was about. It might help you just reflect on your practices, your policies, your country, you know, the whole situation, I guess, globally around inclusion.
Okay, Great. So thank you for that. And I wanted to make that link back to the activity. So if I could just get, I'm just trying, sorry, Catherine, just trying to get sometimes Prezi does this, it decides it's going to start back at the beginning again. So
Okay.
I will just find your place. Perfect. Universal design in practice. So over to you.
Okay, so before I get into actually explaining the Universal Transformational Management Framework, I just wanted to give credit to some colleagues who collaborated on its development. So Una Moynihan from the Health and Leisure Department in IT Tralee, Breda O'Dwyer from the Centre for Entrepreneurship and Enterprise Development, also in IT Tralee, and Gerard Mastu-Yelemus from the UNESCO Chair Research Centre, who over 2 years completed a validation study with input from people across many sectors, and who also creatively came up with our atom graphic for the UTMF. So I just wanted to thank them, and I also want to reference and acknowledge as I mentioned, Sport for Development and Sport and Development, Katharina Schluter, whose name you mentioned earlier, Tom, and you got the pronunciation quite good on that. So she is German.
I did. That's one name at least from many. So
I refer to Katharina through some of the work that I mentioned in relation to our Plan to Inclusivize programme and our collaborators in Plan International indeed. We also use the UTMF in practice in a fitness programme, UFIT, which we are delivering with URSA, and I note Alex was on here earlier as well, and we've applied it as well in some other contexts, even in physical education. And the third area that I thought might be useful to reference is global active cities that we're mentioning. Someone mentioned working with councils and municipalities earlier and giving them a good framework. And through global active cities, we've developed an inclusive standard for physical activity and physical education that cities can now apply for, to show that their physical activity offers within the city, in whatever part of the world the city is in, is inclusive. And the UTMF is involved in that as well. So UTMF is developed from an expansion of teaching tools that we were using here in the Institute to teach sports development and onward into adapted physical activity. Basically looking at action areas for inclusion. However, we initially it was just focused on the P's, which you'll see in a minute. As I'm speaking, I'm conscious you can't see them right now, but they were the P's, are the action points. We're very conscious that it's fine if people are ready to take action and they're committed to take action, that they'll use the P's and they'll, build them into the activities that they're doing. But if they don't fully appreciate or believe the need for inclusive action, then they're unlikely to do it or to fully commit to it, especially from a management level, let's say. And for that to thread through the organization as a universal approach, it's not going to happen if the commitment is not there and the understanding as to why it's important is not there. So we added the V's. It was also lacking elements that would support, I suppose, the day-to-day operation of the P's, or the inclusive approach, and the sustainability of that inclusive approach. So we added I's. So the Universal Transformational Management Framework emerged from that. The Universal looks at it, this is for all. The transformation identifies the change process that we accept is involved at this point in time for organizations to become more inclusive. The management is about the importance of leading from the top. It's relevant for all people within the organization, but we believe it is very important that who's ever managing or who's ever designing the policy, the program, is very much buys into the universality of it. And then the framework gives you a guide to implement to ensure that all your practices are inclusive. Theoretically, the framework combines aspects of behavior change, strategic planning, organizational change, sports development, innovation, design thinking, sustainable development, and universal design. So it combines many different aspects. Practically, it's a validated framework that can be used as a management tool universally in sports organizations, programs, and/or policies. We've used it in different contexts. We've used it to develop our own policy at the UNESCO Chair, or our blueprint document. We also use it in designing training. Our UFIT training, the management training component of that is based on it. And we've used it as a reflection tool for auditing existing practices. So it has many uses. And I think as everybody who are coming from a diverse background on this call listens to you know, how I'm going to explain it today, you should be able to see a fit for your program or your policy or your action or your research for the framework. So I'll just go on to the next slide there.
Shall I bring up that the diagram actually, Catherine? I'm a little behind your flow, I think, because that might be quite useful, because we've mentioned some of the P's and the I's, and
yeah,
if that's all right. One or two of the group have asked if we can, because it's my fault because I've given you less time, so I know I've asked you to get through this, but they've just asked if we can slow slightly with the with speaking,
okay.
if that's okay. We've got time.
No
but I did take like 15 minutes longer earlier, so I've sped up the whole thing.
Okay.
If that's okay, that'd be great. And I'll just bring up the diagram. I'm just conscious I got a little bit behind your flow there, and we started to get into the P's and the I's and the V's. So okay.
No, you're perfect, Tom. I was only giving a little bit of background on them, actually.
Oh,
so
okay, great.
Okay, so if you want to bring up the diagram, great. So we're on the V's, and the V's consolidate the motivation for action, as you can see there. They tell us why inclusion is really important, and they affirm for people the importance of the inclusive context from the perspective of relevant stakeholders in the context of local, national, or international policy. This shapes a transformative vision and provides the impetus for action with the beliefs that the benefits outweigh the cons. So this is something that we found was really important to really ensure that those involved in implementing inclusive practice understood and really believed in why they were doing it. So verification is about building the evidence base, finding out what you need to do, finding out that you definitely need to do something to become more inclusive, having a look at what's needed in your locality. It's about the change. Change can be challenging for people, and we really need to know that it's important and why it is important. Are you inclusive at present? And are there people in your community or country underserved or excluded from whatever product or service offering you're promoting? Does the population you offer your service to reflect your community in terms of the population with disability? Do you need to be inclusive? Why? Is it a human rights motivation, a social justice issue? Understanding why you need to be inclusive really helps people affirm the work that they're going to do and advocate for inclusion across their whole organization and all the people that are involved in the service that they're trying to promote. Then we look at the value proposition. So what's the value to your organization and program and policy of universal access? Again, we believe that for the actions to follow and in the programs that we have developed, including P2I, UFIT, the Global Active Cities Initiative, our physical education program, we believe that people really need to understand the value of inclusive action. The value proposition can vary from person to person. For some, it's about meeting human rights obligations or breaking down stigma. But for others, it might mean greater access to program funds or more people to avail of their program. So whether the motivation is altruistic or otherwise, if it increases inclusive practice, it's a good thing and a step towards universality and changing perceptions. Once you have those two steps taken, you then create your vision. How do you envision yourself after the changes, or your organization, or your policy, or your country's practice? Visions need to be clear and concise and future-oriented. Your vision statement is crucial for the development of your organization as it sets up an aspirational strategy of development for which to strive. So they're the V's, and we see these as a very important foundational step. If people skip these and they jump straight into the action points, which is often the temptation, then they may not have ingrained or instilled enough of the motivation for why this is important for themselves. This year, the Kazan Action Plan, or last year, 2017 in July, UNESCO brought together the world's sports ministers in Kazan in Russia to identify areas for critical action that were needed across physical education, physical activity and sport. And inclusive action and universal design are very much highlighted and pointed to as being priority areas throughout the Kazan Action Plan and follow-up framework. 195 countries agreed to take action towards the attainment of the Kazan Action Plan aspirations. And so that's really significant. And it's a change in direction also from UNESCO from policy intent to calling on people to take specific action that's going to be monitored in the ensuing period until MINEPS 7, which will be in 3 years' time. Part of the Kazan Action Plan, you can see point 3 there, looks at the Sustainable Development Goals and linking to development priorities. Point 4 points to the sport as an enabler of sustainable development and peace. And they are really important points. Point 2 up above, sorry Tom, highlights sport for all and the importance of sport for all. Within the Kazan Action Plan, or sorry, point 14 on the next page, which you may not have, also points to the importance of inclusive action, affirming continued commitment to quality physical education as the most important means to ensure inclusive action takes place. In the follow-up framework of MINEPS, the follow-up framework also identifies 3 thematic areas. The first theme is developing a comprehensive vision of inclusive access for all to sport, physical education, and physical activity. Secondly, maximizing the contribution of sport to sustainable development and peace. Again, ensuring that sustainability is inclusive action. And so that really affirms for people, I think, on this call, wherever you may be, that your country, most likely 195 countries, agreed to take these actions. So this really, from the point of view of determining your value proposition, your vision, and verifying the need for more inclusive action, I think that the Kazan Action Plan gives it to you right there. So in terms of the work that you're doing to make your activity more inclusive, you're supporting what your government has committed, actions that your government has committed to taking, and maybe that's something that it would be worth your while liaising with them on and pointing out. So I'll go back to the P's, Tom, or on to the P's. And the P's guide the action components I mentioned. So each of the P's gives systematic consideration of each P will guide effective practice. Policymakers and relevant stakeholders can be assured that their planning has been comprehensive and that each aspect has catered for inclusion. Each area has scope for incremental change and improvement over time. So again, going back to doing what you can with what you have for now, what we recommend with this and what we found in action works is if a manager who's devising an inclusive program takes a look at each of these areas and identifies what they're currently doing and what they need to do to make their actions more inclusive across these 8 Ps, then it really helps them work towards and progressively more and more towards providing inclusive services for all members of their community. So philosophy is the first one, and it refers to the values and the belief system that guides your organization or program. Everyone should embody the ideology and the values, and your mission statement should reflect that. So everyone within your organization, if the manager is devising this philosophy for your organization, does everybody within the organization know that philosophy and buy into that philosophy and exude that philosophy, I suppose, to the users of the service and the community in which it's located? So then the processes. Processes describe the methods and approaches that you use to the practice of inclusion within an organization. A universal approach should consider using processes such as collaborative management, advocacy, democratic consultation, capacity building, and relationship building, for example, with disability services. So someone in the earlier exercise mentioned linking up with other people and getting the opinions from people within the community, and I think this is a very important part of that. So linking out that relationship building, maybe with disability services or with people with disabilities in your community, to come in and have a look at your program, whatever your program is, and determine, are their needs met, and are needs of other people with disabilities perhaps met within the processes, within the service that's on offer. Onto policies. Again here, someone mentioned financial constraints in the earlier exercise as being a difficulty. So this is where you have to have a look at your policies, and are your policies enabling, or are they providing, are they creating barriers for some people who may want to access your programs and services? Policies are documents and guidelines that are implemented as procedures or protocols to meet the inclusive desired standard. They need to reflect the philosophy that we mentioned earlier on and the processes. So you have to look at your main policies, your charging policy, going back to the financial issue. Do you charge for carers, for example? Do you enable people who may be on disability benefit or who may be out of work as a result of disabilities to access the services that you have under a scheme? Do you have any available policy that safeguards the principle of universality? How often do you review or update your policies? Is there any mechanism to integrate feedback into the policy making process? So as the people in your locality give you feedback, do you integrate that back into your policy, change your policies as a result? People came up again earlier in your earlier exercise many times, and this refers to the leadership within the organization, both at the management and service level. They're crucial, a crucial element in the inclusion process. It also relates to the service users, participants, collaborators, other stakeholders, as I mentioned earlier on. And it has to be a kind of a democratic process to come up with programs that are effective, services that are effective for people. Do they all embrace and know about your inclusive focus? If the people in your community and you offer an inclusive service or a universally designed service, if nobody knows about it in your community, then it's not necessarily going to attract those people. So somebody mentioned there from Peru, listening to all stakeholders, and I think that's an important part of the people issue there as well. Perception links back to attitude, as Eli mentioned it as one of the 4 environments, attitudinally, and goes a little bit beyond attitudinal barrier to whether or not people with disabilities realize they can be included. What's the perception out there of your product or your service or your program? A universal approach aims to change negative attitudes related to embracing diversity and encouraging positive attitudes in regard to equal participation in all mainstream settings. Likewise, it aims to influence the perceptions of people with disabilities regarding their ability to take part. So attitudes influence perceptions, and someone earlier mentioned word of mouth as well. So people in their community, if they realize that your program, that your sport, your activity allows and enables people with disabilities to take part, they will tell other people with disabilities, and hence universality will become more of the norm for your offering. Promotion obviously involves heightening awareness of your activity. And again, as many people said earlier, let people know about what you're doing. What are you doing to encourage people with disabilities to take part? Show empowering images of people with disabilities taking part in your programs and services, and share stories that have of people with disabilities engaging and their lives being maybe empowered. Share stories of staff involved in your program who have really enjoyed working with people with disabilities through the programs that you're offering. Places, where Eli mentioned places a lot earlier on, so it's all the different components that make that place accessible or otherwise, including the equipment and everything else. So I'm going to move on to the eyes. Tom, if you want to bring in the eyes there. So the eyes ensure that the action elements can be resourced and delivered, their impact is monitored, and that there's scope for adjustment and responsiveness to new opportunities that may arise. So again here, sometimes a lot of action can take place around inclusion, but less often it's effectively supported or implemented and resourced so as it can become sustainable and a normal day-to-day part of the offer of the service offer of a particular organization. So if you want it to become that sustainable offer, then you need to make sure it's effectively resourced, and that's not a time-bound resourcing, it's a continuous resourcing, and that you monitor the impact on it from the perspective of all the stakeholders in your organization. And this is really important. So what impact has this new inclusive approach approach and universal approach had on your staff, on the community that you're aiming to provide for, and everybody in that stakeholder mix, the people who have been participants within it. It's also enabling you to be responsive, make adjustments as you go along. We don't always get everything right the first time. Listen to feedback, adjust to things, and adjust to new opportunities that may arise. Many people mentioned equipments and new technologies and IKT and TPACT and various different things. As new things come on board to help make the world a more universally designed and inclusive place, then we need to be able to bring these things in and engage with them. One thing from the point of view of the implementation here that I thought and impact monitoring that I thought I'd mention is the Washington questions. Because often when you're in the domain of disability, and depending on your context, it can be hard to ask participants questions around, well, what disability do you have and how does it impact upon you? So hence, as a result, some of our, we know that there's a huge data void in the area of disability inclusion, and particularly in sport around the world, and especially disaggregated disability data. So the UN Statistical Commission came up with the Washington Group questions, short questions, and there are long questions and other resources there that can help you get over that and help you in monitoring the impact of the inclusive activity on the stakeholders that you have, and the stakeholders with disability, and help produce that disaggregated data that we need to help make everything more inclusive. So just then onto the impact. Plans should be put in place from the outset to monitor that impact. Don't do it after the case. Start from the beginning. Have your monitoring and your impact analysis tools ready from the outset to really get a gauge on the impact that this has had on all stakeholders. And in some cases, it's not always where you think it's going to be. I think many times people think that analysing impact or offering universal services are for the benefit solely of people with disabilities. They're for the benefit of, there's a universal benefit, they're for everybody's benefit, and often the staff will achieve a benefit. It's the family and friends of the people with a disability who experience the benefit of that inclusive approach as well, because they can now go and engage in the activity alongside somebody who may have a disability within their family and or community. Staff can report greater job satisfaction, and we've seen that in many areas where working with people with disabilities can be a really positive experience for staff who may otherwise have been somewhat demotivated. It can also be something that breaks down myths surrounding disability, myths and superstition, and a lot of different things. So just getting people to have that understanding around disability and what it's about. So it's a very important part of the whole equation, and really we shouldn't try and ignore that. And be innovative. There's always an opportunity to bring in something new. It's a learning process, and as we mentioned with the pathway to inclusion, it's about doing what you can with what you have. So, there'll always be somebody different with a different set of interests and needs, and you'll have a different set of equipment and tools to work with, and be as innovative as you can to meet individuals' needs and interests in terms of sport. And then they're much more likely to stick with the activity that you'll offer for them. So there's some of the key things around the Universal Transformational Management Framework that I wanted to mention. And I think it brings together some of the environments and the principles that were mentioned earlier into a very coherent framework that's easily used to design your program, your policy, or your service, to reflect on your program, policy, and service, or to develop onwards, to progress your service. And we have lots of tools to support that. We've used it, as I mentioned, in a range of contexts. And what we found is that people feel it brings together things that they may have earlier thought were kind of somewhat disparate or disconnected. And it connects them, it packages up the process in a way that they can kind of understand. And really, by going through those V's, you're helping change the mindset towards a much more inclusive one that stems into then advocating for that action across the P's, and really then gathering evidence that this is really worthwhile, and that whole cycle continues, and hopefully the resourcing continues and everything else follows suit. People mentioned the international policy earlier and policy implementation. Well, this is a guide to help you look at that policy and take it and then try and implement it. And as I mentioned, Kazan Action Plan and the Washington questions give definitive ideas as to what needs to be done, maybe, or what can be done. Like with Kazan, in the case of Kazan, it's likely whatever country you're in, they have signed up to that and they've agreed to take inclusive action. So for yourself, pointing that out, even in fundraising efforts that you might have to run your program, or in reporting on the activity that you do, aligning that work to the Kazan Action Plan and follow-up framework is a good idea. Encouraging the utilization of the Washington questions again within your country will get over many hurdles that many organizations have around asking questions about disabilities that people have. We also know that many people don't identify as having a disability, so it gets you over that as well, and enables us to capture quality rich information that will hopefully help us break down the barriers that we know exist and have that more equitable access, and get over the fact that we know that significantly less people with disabilities engage in physical education, physical activity and sport, and we really want to change that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Catherine. And yeah, we're going to, just to say to group 2, we're going to share, well, obviously the presentation will share, so they'll be able to take a closer look as we got up on the screen here at the UTMF, and we'll share links through to the other resources as well, just so everybody can access them too. Brilliant. Well, Catherine, we were going to go on and give an example of this in practice as well. We also want to leave room for the questions too. Would it be okay to give a quick overview just of the project where this has been applied, maybe for a couple of minutes, and then we'll go into questions for 15 minutes? Would that be all right?
Yeah, I can. I'm going to be very quick on that. So I think what I tried to do there is just integrate some mention. You've just got some photographs there now that come. I mentioned Katerina.
Photographs. Actually, it's so. And this slide too, which actually referenced the project that you've been talking about. So.
Yeah, so Katerina leads this project and has delivered this in many different countries in collaboration with Plan International and also with International Needs UK as well. So it's about building capacity and empowering, and so this is one of the programs. Katerina, the training manual for this is just in the final stages of it's just about to be released very shortly, and the UTMF that I've just gone through is referenced in that. And so that program is one where UTMF is used. The UFIT program is another one, and again, we've delivered that. I note there was someone there from Lima, Special Olympics Lima, who we've linked with as well in the UFIT program in many countries. It's in the US. Alex is there as well from USA in relation to that. So it's very much embedded as part of the training program for that, and also Global Active Cities, which is not here. I don't know if you have other slides there, Tom, on the photographs. Maybe it's just this one. But anyway, here you can see the Sustainable Development Agenda, how this fits into it, how inclusion fits into that agenda. I've mentioned how it fits into Kazan. So, we have found through the work that we've done with the UTMF, we've got really positive feedback about its application and relevance, and how it just helps people get that understanding and kind of, I suppose, packaging up of the inclusive actions that they maybe need to take, and breaks them up into the different areas. We have an audit tool where you can assess how, the areas that you're very good at and the areas that you need work on within your organization or your program in relation to each of the elements of the UTMF. So that's a helpful tool. It can be used as a self-audit to just get started, to really reflect. We encourage a lot of reflective practice, and the UTMF can give a very strong basis for this. And the feedback that we get from people where we use it is that it's a very good guide to help them, I suppose, extract and drill down through the different elements that make a program or a policy operational, and help them see their strengths and weaknesses and move on from there.
Brilliant, thank you. And so it's really great to actually have an example to use following, obviously a lot of theory there in the earlier part of the presentation. So really appreciate sharing both a framework and a practical example that takes universal design and puts it into practice. So really appreciated, Catherine. Thank you.
No
And
problem.
we now will now just go into the Q&A part of the presentation. So we do have some questions and comments coming back through. So Eli, if I could bring you off mute with Catherine, are you with us too?
Yep, I'm here. Thank you.
So we have a few questions and comments. I think we have 4. What we'll do is if we could perhaps just read them out and then have you respond, just again for the time. I think that might be best. I think Eli, you could stay a few minutes after. So we've got 15 minutes. We can have a look through. And we've still got there are just shy of 50 of us on the call. It went up to 60 at one point, I think. So some had to drop off a bit earlier, but are asking for the recording. So it'd be good. I think also Eli and I were just exchanging messages of we've got these questions here. We've got questions from the registration process. We're going to have a chat about how we address these questions relating to today's topic, but more widely. So if you did ask a question as part of registration, we're thinking of how we can get to that and how we can share that more widely with the group. But we've got a few questions here. So Eli, I think you've also been, I'm guessing, seeing them coming in, or are there any you'd like to pick out, or would you like me to pick out one to start with? Well, for Eli and Catherine, but I know Eli, you would have had more of a chance to look at them. Sorry, Eli.
I'm perfectly happy for you to choose the ones that you like to direct to Catherine and I.
Perfect. Well, I'll just go down the list. We didn't, Silvana, we didn't hear from you earlier, so if I could read out your question first of all. So Silvana is from Play and Train in Spain, and was part of our webinar in December, but also gave us feedback on our theory of change last year. So Silvana, welcome back. And her comment is that we talk about people with disabilities in a very broad way, because it changes a lot depending on the level of disability or the level of capacity. This is something that bothers me as I'm seeing problems in our day-to-day activities, I guess, in relation to that. I guess any thoughts on that, Eli, Catherine? Is that something that you also come across at all? Any thoughts?
Yeah, this is it's obviously there's a huge variation in disability and multiple disability and double disability and a whole range of factors there. I guess one of the things that we have that we consider to be important when we're encouraging somebody to take the first step towards inclusive action is to start maybe in an area of disability that they're comfortable with. And we assume that this would always be on a kind of easier side of a spectrum of disability. However, that's not always the case. It can be where somebody has some knowledge or experience of somebody with a particular disability type or combination of disabilities, and they may well start with people with more complex needs. So it is something that's variable. With the programs that we develop, especially the fitness program, we encourage that people move, that they don't always stay with their activities at the easier end of a disability spectrum, but that they move across people, providing for people with more complex needs as well. And we would very actively encourage that as people gain their own competence around working with people with disabilities, we ask them to expand the range of people and working towards people with more complex needs as they do that.
Great,
and
I
would just quickly add that I think it is really that balance of understanding and recognizing the specific population that you're working with and the specific disability, whether it's a visual disability, a physical disability, intellectual, cognitive, sensory, so forth, to really understand that and to look at the right environment, the right approach, really just supporting a lot of what Catherine just said in terms of developing the program around that. But it is this balance of addressing a specific disability, but also addressing the environment and creating that universal design approach that it's really serving all people, because many of the interventions and the way that you're addressing it are not only going to benefit those with a disability, but they're going to benefit everybody. And I think that's really the idea behind universal design, is how can it be for anybody, whether you have a disability or not. But again, it is kind of that nuanced approach. So,
and can I also,
oh, sorry, Catherine.
Sorry, Tom. Just to add, I see Jennifer Leo is on the call here as well, and Jen was with us until recently in the UNESCO chair. And with Jen, we developed a resource called UFIT Explorer, which looks at stories of people with disabilities engaging in a range of different physical activity types, and it can be combinations of different disability types as well, but the story of the interaction with the environments and a range of different factors, we're adding in like some information about the particular disability type and pathophysiology and other things that we know that people want to know about, because we've looked at the feedback we've got from programs, and we're adding to resources all the time to develop them so as they're fit for purpose and match people's needs, who are out there delivering coaching, physical education, sport and fitness.
Yeah, that's great. That would be great to share that, Catherine. Yeah.
I was about to say another thing to share. So that if we can, Catherine, that'd be awesome. I'll be gathering these links and resources together. What we can share after the webinar would be great.
Excellent. Yeah.
Silvana mentioned too, and I want to make sure everything's followed up. But Silvana's mentioned that they work with disabilities from less to high all disabilities from less to high disability. All are able to practice sport. The problem they're finding more is from society surrounding, which we covered a little bit in our exercise too. And they use a type of assessment a little more thorough than the one presented, because our practice brought us to change. And Silvana, if you are happy to share that assessment, I understand. If not, it'd be great to see it. I'm guessing it's in Spanish, but could be really interesting to see. But I'm not. I don't want to put you under. Well, I have already put you under pressure. But if you can, that's great. If you can't, we understand.
Yeah, it's great to have Silvana with us and all of her expertise and knowledge. So, yeah, no, we're really happy that she's been part of this effort all along.
Definitely, I'd concur. So if I take another question, if we could go to Isagol, and I'm sure I'm getting your name wrong a third time, but and Isagol is from a research assistant from Middle East Technical University from Turkey, and she's asked what is your opinion about adding a dimension such as gender conditions to consider in universal design? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can address that just briefly. I think that's a really great question. I think it really speaks to the fact that when you're talking about inclusion and opportunity, it does also intersect with issues of gender and sex, so forth. And I think it's really about creating that right environment. There may be certain contexts where it works for boys and girls and men and women to participate together. It may be more appropriate for it to be a gender-specific program. So I think that as part of that intersection of universal design, it's about more of the overall principles and where does it make sense. Particularly often we see at younger levels, boys and girls are oftentimes interacting together in play settings, encouraging that. Although in certain contexts, it may be more appropriate to have a girl-specific program and a boy-specific program. So again, I think that's really contextual, and I think we see a lot of success in both models, and even more variations, other things that people are creating and innovating. So again, I think both, from what I can share and Catherine can add, but I think both of what we shared is sort of the general principles, but also the flexibility in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the intersectional approach is one that's very important. And I think I mentioned Kazan action plan, and you will note in that, and it's been commented to me many times, that maybe disability isn't explicitly mentioned as many times as people would like to have seen it. And the rationale behind that was around the intersectional argument, and a lot of discussion and debate came up around use of language and terminology in this document, and the decision to put in sport for all. Yes, gender is explicitly mentioned, I have to say, but aside from that, sport for all, inclusive design, inclusive practice is mentioned. And in mentioning that, the intention was to look as intersectionally as possible. But when the elements of the follow-up framework are being drilled down through, we are looking at the explicit needs, let's say, of a population group with disability, and then explicit needs of other groups. But the approach overarchingly is one of universal design and intersectionality. And as Eli mentioned there as well, when looking at that universal design component, the benefits for many others, like parents with buggies in an environment, or many other members of the community, are also addressed simultaneously. And I know someone mentioned earlier specialist equipment versus mainstream equipment. Ideally, we get to a situation where there's little distinction. Obviously, there'll be need for specialist supports in certain areas, but for the majority of say equipment or venues, the more closer we can get to universal and inclusive design, the better for all, and the less need for maybe specialist, acknowledging that there'll also always be needs for for certain equipment and activities to be provided for.
That's a great question about gender. That might be a good for the discussion board and the intersectionality. I think this is a really important topic to continue to discuss.
And we did, just to mention, because I think only you and I have had a discussion about a discussion board. Probably we got excited. We were, Eli and I were thinking earlier that there might be, because there were quite a few questions coming into the registration process, which were I haven't shared actually. I'm not sure if I shared with Eli and Catherine, Sneh and Amy, who are part of organising this project. There were some really interesting questions there too. So just to let you know, Eli and I were thinking, and we'll have a chat after, just about whether we could set up a discussion board or some way to interact, as 160 people in the end registered. So very interesting mix of experience. So just to throw that in there as well, I think would be good. But that was a great idea, Eli. So if I could come on to maybe just a couple more questions, if that's all right. If anybody needs to drop off, of course, feel free to. This is being recorded. I think we've still got 40 people around. If I could come to Damien Haslett next. And Damien, we was part of the activities earlier. He's a PhD researcher from the University of Birmingham in Ireland. His question is, many barriers in many places around the world, so many barriers to physical activity and sport around the world are beyond the limits of sport organisations. For example, unemployment, inaccessible transport, lack of education, negative attitudes towards impairment. Or how should sport organisations have policies in place to highlight, raise awareness or advocate for social change around as structural, historical, political barriers, disableism, etc. So, for example, at the end, should sport play a role in social disability activism and, I guess, advocacy? I've added that on the end, but that's what I assume is.
I guess that's really good. I can just quickly chime in, and then
sure.
Obviously, Catherine. I think that's part of the idea of the Sport for Development framework, is to think about how sport can be a platform, can be utilized as a catalyst, can be utilized as a tool for broader education, broader health, broader community outcomes, and how can that be sort of integrated within the frameworks, within the curriculum, within the different approaches. And so it's not necessarily that sport is going to be the solution for everything. It's just about how that it can potentially contribute, can help share some of the broader ideas and broader understanding, And so I think that's part of the idea behind sport for development in many ways, is how can this be a vehicle for that? Even within the sport development programs, can there be pieces of it? Clearly within the sport development, it's, you know, sport as sport itself. But at the same time, can there be messages interwoven, or the platform to be utilized to consider the broader barriers in society, the broader issues that are going on, ableism and so forth. So I think it's about how do we address that, and I think that's what we've seen over the years is, and through Sport for Development, is that sport is this platform, and so how do we utilize it? And so I think that's part of what this conversation is. Part of the universal design piece is how do we kind of utilize this to create a better society? You know, that sport is one piece of the puzzle within universal design. It's about all aspects of society, but sport is one aspect of our society. So how do we address it? So I'll turn it over to Catherine as well to address it.
I think it's a fantastic question, and I do think that people operating in the domain of sport, operating in isolation, will never address those bigger picture contexts that enable us to even get to the reality where sport becomes universally accessible to a certain extent. I think the biggest opportunity that's out there right now to try and address the question that you ask, and the kind of overarching systemic problems that that underpin some of the reasons why sport may not be as accessible to all as we would like, comes through the Sustainable Development Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think between now and 2030, we have a big window of opportunity to educate people about what sport can do in the context of the appropriate enabling environments. So all the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are indivisible and inseparable. So as you quite rightly say, health, education, sustainable cities, peace, all those factors will contribute to the quality of somebody's life and their ability then to participate in activities such as sport and physical activity, and to be employed, not just to participate, but to employed and to lead the areas. I think sport is recognized within the Sustainable Development Agenda as an important enabler of sustainable development. And then you've got many different initiatives around the world at policy level and into practice level that are well resourced, and a lot of attention of global policy leaders on how can we achieve these sustainable development goals and monitoring achievement towards the attainment of sustainable development goals. So I think it's up to those as well in the sport sector to show what they can do and the power that sport can have, and also identify the other factors that need to be in place as well. We all know that all these factors need to be in place if somebody is going to be realistically able to embrace and engage with sport. So I think the Sustainable Development Agenda gives us the platform. We have work to do. The Kazan Action Plan that I mentioned outlines to governments how sport can feed into that agenda very clearly, and calls on governments to take specific policy actions towards achieving what sport can achieve in that universal format for health, for social inclusion, for many different areas. And we have work to do to keep that highlighted and keep it on the agenda. So there's interconnecting areas as well. You've smart cities. I mentioned global active cities earlier. The fact that it's an inclusive standard, like an ISO standard, ISO compatible standard that cities can go for to show that their offer is inclusive. There's the Urban Habitat Agenda, which again embraces inclusion and health and well-being of all people, through the World Urban Forum and lots of other factors that are all highlighted at the Sustainable Development Agenda. Those parallel areas that need to be worked on together if the 2030 agenda for sustainable development is to be realized, then many things need to happen in parallel. And we do need to continue to point them out, and we do need to keep highlighting the importance of sport as that enabler of sustainable development as well.
Yeah, that's great, Catherine. You brought up the Sustainable Development Goals, so thank you so much. That's great.
No, thank you both. And what I would suggest that we just as we wind down, just because I know Eli, you need to shoot off quite shortly. So what I might suggest actually is that we read out some of the remaining questions and comments just to make sure that everyone's heard who's asked a question, and they're things we can perhaps take offline and think about how we respond to questions. Eli, if I could pick that up with you next week, maybe. That'd be grand. We were just talking about it a little earlier. So if that'd be okay with you both, I'll go through and read them out so we can hear what the questions are. But I think we might then need to go into next steps and wrapping up for today. I don't want to take anybody too far over our 2 hours. So just is that okay with you both?
Fine by me, Tom.
Sounds great. Yes.
Great. Okay, so the other questions and comments that we had, there's a general question here from Candace, who asked if we'll be sharing the attendance list for the webinar. That's more of a question for me, I think, on the practical side. So we'll answer that one quickly because it's more of a practical point. I would really like to. I just need to talk with the rest of the team because I didn't actually ask specifically in our form if we could do that. I think there's an assumption we probably could, but I will just check because it's a fascinating list of people and backgrounds. So I'm going to look into that. The other questions we had, so I'll just scroll down, and oh, Kelly's pulled these together for me in an email as well, which is very handy. So the next one, Andrea Ruiz, and Andrea is a psychologist from Special Olympics Peru, we heard from earlier. So how can we guide teachers and students about inclusion in schools? And then Minraj Pathi, and Minraj is from Plan International in Nepal, and he made a couple of points. So the first was enhancing skills and knowledge for physical education for disabled persons can be instrumental, but bringing it into practice is really hard in poor communities due to financial constraints and so on. And then the remaining questions we had, again from Minraj, so why do we consider physical education as more important from our side rather than considering other issues of the person with a disability? And I think, yes, we had Don picked up and come through on chat from Ron Peck. So Ron is from the Blind Judo Foundation. So Ron mentioned sport transcends all aspects of life, interaction between people of all backgrounds. Benefits include, but not limited to, building confidence, character, humility, respect, and responsibilities, to name but a few. It's about interfacing and working with all, which is actually a very nice place to
good from the sport for
finish,
development,
to bring in sport for development and the aspects of universal design, I think, too. So
and those questions about education are great too. So that would be great to have a
really good question.
Yeah, those are all great questions.
One we've had, we just run out of time. I was just really impressed by the quality of the questions coming through is great. Cool. So I think it just remains, for those of you left with us, about 35 of us left on the call, just to explain very quickly just the next steps with the webinar and with this project, because this is the first of 6 webinars this year. They're all going to follow a similar format. We'll have a main topic, we'll have a presentation and some background in theory, and then we will get into exercises and Q&A. What we're going to work on in the meantime is just how we deal with questions, how we share resources in a efficient way with this wider group. But just to say, so what you'll get next, early next week, is a recording of the webinar to yourselves, to everybody that's signed up and couldn't make it, and then we'll also then at some point in the next week or two be getting the next date of the next topic across to you for the webinar. I'm just coming across to bring up our little calendar. Just one moment. Seems my Zoom options have decided disappear. So if we come into our calendar we looked at earlier, the next one's quite soon, is on the 25th of May, but normally there's a 2-month gap throughout the year between these, and the end of year is more of a review of the year webinar. So the next webinar is on Friday the 25th of May at the same time. We would love to get any ideas on the topic of that webinar, so please either write them in the question box here or send me an email, and we'll certainly consider that and come back to you all. And I think the final thing really is just to thank, of course, our presenters, so Eli and Catherine, for all their expertise they've shared, and their own time and expertise that they've shared. To all of you for your input, it's really appreciated. And also to Dom and to Kelly, to my colleagues who've been quietly working away in the background throughout this webinar. And finally to Sneh and Amy, who are part of organising this as well. And I hope you all have a good remainder of the day, wherever you, or evening or night, wherever you are in the world. And we really hope to welcome you back in May for the next webinar in the knowledge exchange. So thank you all.
Thank you, Tom.
Oh, yes.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Eli. Thanks, Catherine. And I should have said, to exit the webinar, you just click at the cross in the top right-hand part of your panel, and that will take you out of the webinar. So thanks again, and have a good weekend.